In this video, we're going to be working through some extra practice examples for lesson 7.3 on page 209 in your student journal. This lesson is all about determining how we can know a quadrilateral is a parallelogram. And so I'm just going to bring your attention to this slide here. This image is on page 208 in your student journal. So as we look at some of the problems, these are some of the ways we can know that a quadrilateral is a parallelogram. One thing we can look for is this second way. If we know that opposite sides are congruent, then we know it's a parallelogram. For the third way, if we can see that opposite angles in a quadrilateral are congruent, then we know it's a parallelogram. The fourth way, if we know that one pair of opposite sides is parallel and congruent, then we know the quadrilateral is a parallelogram. And then lastly, if we know that the diagonals bisect each other, if they cut each other in half into two congruent pieces, then we know it's a parallelogram. So we're going to go ahead and apply these rules to 1, 2, and 3 on page 209 in our student journal. So it says in exercises 1 through 3, state which theorem you can use to show that the quadrilateral is a parallelogram. We're not going to worry about giving the specific name of the theorem. We're just going to describe in words how we know that it's a parallelogram. So in number 1, we have this quadrilateral, and they tell us two things about it. The first thing they tell us is that these two opposite sides are parallel. That's what the arrows mean. Now, if that was the only information we had, we wouldn't be able to tell if it was a parallelogram. However, they also tell us that these opposite sides both have a measure of A. And so these opposite sides are parallel and congruent. If we know that a pair of opposite sides are parallel and congruent, we know it's a parallelogram. So I'm just going to say opposite sides are parallel and congruent. I should more specifically say one pair of opposite sides. We didn't need to know if both pairs of opposite sides were parallel and congruent. All right, let's figure out how we know number 2 is a parallelogram. Well, they tell us that these two angles are 61 degrees, so they are congruent. And these two angles are 119 degrees, meaning they are congruent. We know if both pairs of opposite angles are congruent, it must be a parallelogram. So we know that opposite angles are congruent. And number 3, we have to figure out how we know this is a parallelogram. They give us some information about the diagonals. Notice where the diagonals intersect, they give us some information about these segments. This segment is congruent to this segment, meaning this diagonal, sorry I keep using the word this, I just don't have any labels for me to use. So this diagonal bisects this diagonal. They also show us that this segment with one tick mark is congruent to this segment with one tick mark, meaning this diagonal bisects this diagonal. And so both diagonals bisect each other, which tells us this is a parallelogram. So I'm going to say both diagonals bisect each other. And that's how we can tell that is a parallelogram.